In the early 11th century, the Eastern Empire, governed by rule, ritual, and precedent, faced a border that refused to remain quiet. For decades, the frontier with the Bulgarian lands had absorbed men, grain, and attention. Campaign followed campaign, not as sudden storms, but as a grinding weather, predictable, exhausting, and relentless. Armies marched, withdrew, returned again. Villages learned the rhythm of banners. Fortresses learned the sound of horns at dawn. The empire was not improvising. It was administering. At the center of this administration stood a ruler trained not in spectacle but in continuity. Power was measured in endurance. Victory was not the moment of impact but the condition that followed it. The silence after resistance learned its place. In such a system, punishment was not personal. It was procedural. By the summer of the decisive year, the war had narrowed to a single corridor. Mountain passes, long known to both sides, dictated movement. Control of these passes meant control of supply, retreat, and message. The Bulgarian forces understood this geography as well as the empire did. They fortified where stone already suggested defense. They waited where roads constricted. They expected attrition, not annihilation. What followed did not resemble the heroic clashes of later imagination. There was no single field, no grand charge preserved in verse. There was containment. Columns pressed from multiple directions, escape routes closed. Time became an instrument. When the fighting ended, it ended unevenly. Not all died. Not all fled. A vast number were taken alive. The figure, 15,000, does not appear as a flourish. It appears as a calculation. The sources repeat it not because it is poetic, but because it is administrative. Such numbers mattered to an empire that counted tax households, military obligations, and grain allotments with the same hand. The captives were not nobles alone, nor were they peasants swept up by chance. They were soldiers, men marked by the state they served, now transferred into the custody of another. Their status changed, but their usefulness did not vanish. The question was not what had happened to them, but what was to be done with them. In earlier wars, captives could be ransomed, exchanged, absorbed, or sold. Each option had precedent. Each required resources, negotiations, and time. This group, however, was too large for casual handling and too politically charged for simple disposal. Their fate would speak beyond their own bodies. The emperor did not need to be present to decide. The system anticipated him. Advisors, officers, legal tradition, all converged toward a solution that aligned with imperial logic: deter recurrence, preserve authority, and do so without destabilizing the frontier with excess mercy or uncontrolled cruelty. The decision was framed not as vengeance, but as message. Orders traveled down the chain of command in language that did not require explanation. The instructions were precise. Uniformity mattered. Consistency mattered. Whatever was to be done must be done the same way to all, with exceptions carefully rationed. Deviations weakened meaning. The act itself, whatever form it took, was not recorded in detail. Chroniclers avoided description, not out of ignorance but out of understanding. To state plainly what was implied would cheapen it. The audience knew enough. The absence of vividness was itself a signal of institutional confidence. What mattered was the result. When the captives were released, they were not released back into war. They were sent back into memory. They moved as a single, altered mass, structured to be seen. Their return path was not secret. It was visible by design. Each step carried the weight of policy. The Bulgarian ruler would see them. The villages would see them. The border would see them. This was not the destruction of an army. It was the restructuring of perception. The empire had learned long ago that death ends resistance but does not teach obedience. Survivors, properly marked, do both. They carry the empire's authority beyond the reach of its soldiers. They speak without words. The chroniclers note a reaction when the group reached its destination. They do not linger on it. Reaction was expected. Shock was expected. What followed was more important. Within the Bulgarian leadership, deliberations changed tone. Confidence did not vanish overnight, but certainty fractured. Negotiations that had stalled reopened. Plans that had assumed parity no longer did. The war did not end immediately, but it began to resolve. This was not mercy. Nor was it uncontrolled brutality. It was calibrated consequence. From the imperial perspective, the operation succeeded because it avoided chaos. No uprising followed among the captives. No international outcry disrupted alliances. The frontier stabilized. The message held. Yet beneath the surface of success, something else lingered. The sources grow quieter after this point. They shift attention back to treaties, borders, and reigns. The men themselves fade into collective reference. Their individual names dissolve. Their bodies remain present only as symbols, and symbols, once released, cannot be recalled. What the empire accomplished that year was not merely the subjugation of an enemy force. It was the demonstration of a method, a reminder that authority could reach beyond the battlefield and into the future, shaping decisions not yet made. But authority, once exercised at this scale, leaves residue. The question that remains is not whether the punishment worked. By the standards of imperial stability, it did. The question is what it costs to rely on such a method, and how often an empire can repeat a message like this before the message begins to speak back. The records do not answer that. They move on. Silence in this case is not absence. It is accumulation. The empire did not treat the aftermath as an emotional event. It treated it as a logistical operation requiring containment, coordination, and silence. Orders moved through offices accustomed to moving men, grain, and law across distance. The act itself had already occurred. Now came the management of its consequences. The first priority was control of narrative. Imperial chronicles did not contradict one another. That alone signals coordination. Differences in tone existed, but not in conclusion. Each account framed the event as necessary, measured, and justified by circumstance. Language remained restrained. There were no flourishes of triumph. No boasting. Excess description would invite scrutiny. Restraint implied legitimacy. In official correspondence, the incident was folded into a broader sequence of campaigns. It was not isolated. It was contextualized. This mattered. Isolation creates scandal. Context creates policy. Within the military hierarchy, the operation became a reference point rather than a lesson. Officers were not instructed to repeat it. They were instructed to remember it. Memory in this system functioned as deterrence without repetition. An empire does not wish to make spectacles routine. It wishes to make them unforgettable. Documentation was careful. Numbers were preserved. Locations were specified only broadly. Individual commanders were rarely named in connection with the act. Responsibility dispersed upward and outward until it belonged to no single hand. This diffusion was not accidental. It was structural protection. The empire understood something fundamental. Excessive clarity can become liability. At the frontier, however, clarity was unavoidable. The return of the captives altered local behavior in ways no decree could. Border communities adjusted movement. Supply caravans altered routes. Messengers delayed departures. The presence of altered survivors functioned as living boundary markers, visible reminders of consequence embedded into daily life. This produced a second effect, internal pressure. Within Bulgarian territory, the burden of explanation fell not on the empire, but on Bulgarian leadership. They were forced to account for what their men had endured and why. The narrative shifted from resistance to risk, from honor to cost. This was not achieved through rhetoric, it was achieved through presence. The empire's silence amplified this pressure. By not responding to outrage, it left space for fear to circulate unchallenged. Fear, when unopposed, becomes interpretation. In diplomatic channels, the empire remained formal. Treaties were discussed. Tribute terms were adjusted. No apology was offered. None was requested. To acknowledge the act directly would elevate it into a negotiable offense. Instead, it was treated as settled fact. The psychological architecture of this approach was deliberate. Punishment in this context was not aimed at the men themselves. They were instruments in a larger demonstration. The true target was decision-making, future councils, future commanders, future calculations of resistance. The empire sought to compress time, to make future wars shorter by extending the shadow of this one. Internally, however, this compression created stress. Not all within the imperial apparatus were indifferent. Monastic sources hint at discomfort, not outrage, but unease. The language is subtle, phrases soften. Responsibility is attributed to necessity rather than intent. This rhetorical distancing suggests internal negotiation between moral tradition and political reality, yet no record suggests reversal. The emperor's authority remained intact. No inquiry followed. No reform addressed the event directly. Silence again served as policy. To reopen the matter would invite judgment. Judgment invites precedent. Precedent limits authority. The system chose continuity. This choice carried consequences beyond the immediate frontier. Other regions observed, not openly but attentively. The empire's reputation adjusted. Not toward chaos or cruelty, but toward inevitability. Resistance was still possible, but the cost was now clearer. That clarity became its own constraint. Future commanders had to consider whether invoking such a memory would escalate conflicts unnecessarily. The event could not be repeated casually without diminishing its weight. This placed pressure on imperial strategy. A single decisive act had created a benchmark difficult to approach again. Thus, paradoxically, the punishment both strengthened and narrowed the empire's options. The documentation reflects this tension. References to the event grow indirect. Allusions replace statements. The empire moved forward, but it carried the memory folded into its administrative fabric. What remained unresolved was not the act itself, but its afterimage. The men who returned did not disappear. They lived. They aged. They became stories repeated in controlled voices. Their existence prevented closure. They embodied a past that could not be corrected, only managed. An empire built on continuity must always ask how much of its past it can afford to remember. By the time treaties stabilized the region, the event had already passed into institutional memory. It no longer required defense. It existed as assumption, but assumptions shape futures, and the question now pressed inward, not outward: how long can authority rely on a single demonstration before it must choose between repetition and restraint? The sources do not answer. They record borders, taxes, reigns. They do not record what it felt like to govern in the shadow of a decision that could not be undone. In the years that followed, official records returned to familiar rhythms: appointments, campaigns, border adjustments, taxation. The machinery of governance resumed its cadence as if nothing singular had occurred. This was not denial. It was method. Singular events threaten systems built on continuity. To survive, the system must flatten them. The men at the center of the decision vanished from narrative focus. Not erased, but generalized. They became the prisoners, the captives, the defeated. Their individuality dissolved into category. Category is safe. Category does not accuse. What remained visible was outcome. The Bulgarian state weakened, not immediately, but irreversibly. Leadership fractures widened. Authority struggled to command the same certainty it once had. This was not solely the result of military loss. Armies can be rebuilt. What could not be rebuilt was confidence in resistance as a rational choice. The empire did not need to return in force as often. Presence could be suggested. Memory did the work. This was the true legacy of the act, a shift from physical domination to psychological governance. Control exercised once, then echoed indefinitely. Borders stabilized not because force disappeared, but because its potential became internalized. Within imperial territory, the silence held. No monuments marked the decision. No festivals recalled it. Even triumphal language was restrained. This absence was intentional. Commemoration invites debate. Debate invites fracture. The empire preferred quiet permanence, yet quiet does not mean absence. Later chroniclers approached the event cautiously. Some softened language, others framed it as grim necessity. A few hinted at divine sanction, a familiar strategy when human agency becomes uncomfortable. None challenged the legitimacy of the authority that ordered it. This unanimity was not accidental. It was inheritance. Institutions teach successors not only what to do, but what not to question. By the time new generations encountered the record, the event had already been normalized, filed among many decisions made in the name of order. The men who carried the consequence lived on the margins of this normalization. Their presence was tolerated, not addressed. They existed as reminders without advocates. History had moved on, they had not. Over time, their story hardened into legend, not dramatic legend, but moral shorthand. A warning embedded in cultural memory, stripped of detail, preserved as outcome. Precision faded, meaning remained. This abstraction was the final transformation. What began as a calculated administrative decision ended as a boundary of imagination, an unspoken line beyond which resistance was reconsidered. The empire did not need to repeat the act. Repetition would cheapen it. One demonstration, properly managed, was sufficient, but legacy is not ownership. Centuries later, when the empire itself weakened, this event did not save it. No memory can indefinitely substitute for legitimacy. Authority sustained by fear must eventually renew itself through consent, reform, or renewal. The sources show that when those failed, memory alone was insufficient. The act remained in the record unchanged, but its power diminished as context shifted. This is the quiet truth buried beneath the episode. The punishment did not define the empire. It revealed it. It showed how power thinks when it is confident, how it calculates, communicates, and conceals. It showed the limits of mercy within systems built to endure. And it showed the cost of decisions designed to echo longer than the moment that required them. What survives now is not outrage nor justification. What survives is structure. A decision made without spectacle, executed without flourish, remembered without closure. An act that solved a problem and created a shadow. And shadows, once cast by authority, remain long after the source has moved on.